The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Translated by Susan Bernofsky. Part 2. Only as dusk was falling did Gregor wake from his heavy, faint-like sleep. He probably wouldn't have slept much longer, even without a disturbance, for he felt sufficiently rested and restored. But it seemed to him he had been woken by a fleeting step and the careful shutting of the door to the vestibule. The pallid gleam of the electric street lamps touched the ceiling here and there and the upper edges of the furniture, but down where Gregor lay, all was dark. Slowly groping awkwardly with his feelers, which he was only now learning to appreciate, he dragged himself toward the door, wanting to see what had happened. His left side felt like one long, unpleasantly contracting scar, and he was forced to limp outright on his 2 rows of legs. One of these diminutive legs, incidentally, had suffered grievous injuries in the course of the morning's events. It was almost miraculously only no one had been injured, and now trailed lifelessly behind him. Not until he reached the door did he realize what in fact had lured him there. It was the smell of something edible. There stood a bowl filled with sweet milk, in which little pieces of white bread were floating. He almost laughed with delight, for his hunger was now even more powerful than in the morning, and right away he dunked his head in the milk, almost up to his eyes. But he quickly drew it out, again, in disappointment. But it wasn't just that eating was difficult, thanks to his tender left side, and he couldn't eat at all without his entire body becoming gaspingly involved. But beyond that, even though milk had always been his favorite drink, which is no doubt why his sister had brought him some, now it didn't taste good to him at all. Indeed, it was almost with revulsion that he turned away from the bowl and crept back to the center of the room. In the living room, as Gregor saw through the crack, the gas had been lit. But while usually at this hour his father liked to read aloud from the afternoon paper to Gregor's mother, and sometimes his sister as well in a dramatic voice, now there was not a sound to be heard. Well, perhaps this customary reading aloud that his sister had often told and written him about had recently fallen out of practice. But even in the other rooms, everything was so still, even though the apartment was surely not empty. What a quiet life my family has been leading, Gregor said to himself, and as he gazed fixedly into the darkness before him, he felt great pride at having been able to give his parents and sister a life like this in such a beautiful apartment. But what if all this tranquility, all this prosperity and contentment were now coming to a horrific end? So as not to get lost in such contemplations, Gregor set himself in motion, crawling back and forth across the room. Once in the course of this long evening, one of the side doors was opened a tiny crack and then quickly shut again. And once the other one. Someone must have felt an urge to enter, and then been overcome by misgivings. Gregor now stationed himself just in front of the living room door, determined to somehow coax the hesitant visitor inside, or at least find out who it was. But the door did not open again, and Gregor waited in vain. Before, when all the doors were locked, everyone kept trying to come in, and now that he had opened the one door, and the others had apparently been opened during the day, no one came, and the keys were sticking in their locks from the outside. It was late at night by the time the light in the living room went out, and now it was easy to ascertain that Gregor's parents and sister had remained awake all this time, for all 3 of them could clearly be heard departing on tiptoe. Now it was unlikely anyone would come into Gregor's room before morning, so he had plenty of time to ponder how best to reorder his life. But this high, open room in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor distressed him, without his being able to determine the cause. After all, it was his room, which he had been living in for 5 years now. And with a half-unconscious motion, and not without a twinge of shame, he scurried beneath the settee, where, even though his back was a bit cramped, and he could no longer raise his head, he at once felt right at home, his only regret being that his body was too wide across to be accommodated entirely beneath this piece of furniture. Here he remained the entire night, which he spent by turns dozing, though he was awoken again and again by his hunger, and mulling over his worries and indistinct hopes, which however all led to the conclusion that, for the time being, he should behave calmly, and by employing patience and the utmost consideration, assist his family in enduring the inconveniences his current state inevitably forced him to impose on them. Early the next morning already, so early it was almost still night, Gregor had the opportunity to test the strength of these resolutions he had made. For from the vestibule his sister, almost completely clothed, opened his door and cast an anxious glance into the room. She didn't immediately spot him, but when she noticed him beneath the settee, well, goodness, he had to be somewhere. It's not as if he might have flown away. The sight so alarmed her that, unable to control herself, she slammed the door from the outside. But as if regretting this conduct, she opened it again, at once, and came in walking on tiptoe as though she were entering the room of a gravely ill patient, or even a stranger. Gregor, having slid his head to just beneath the edge of the settee, observed her. Would she see that he had left the milk standing, and not because of a lack of hunger? And would she bring him some other food more to his liking? If she failed to do so of her own accord, he would sooner starve than call this to her attention, though in fact he felt a nearly monstrous urge to scoot out from beneath the settee, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg her for something good to eat. But his sister immediately remarked with surprise that the bowl was still full, with just a little of its milk spilled on the floor around it, and she picked it up right away, not with her bare hands to be sure, but with a rag, and carried it out of the room. Gregor was exceptionally curious to see what she would bring in its stead and mulled over the various possibilities. But never would he have been able to predict what his sister in her kindness proceeded to do. To gauge his tastes, she brought him an entire assortment of foodstuffs, all spread out on an old newspaper. There were old, half-rotten vegetables, bones from the family supper the night before, caked in a congealed white sauce, a few raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese Gregor had declared inedible 2 days before, a dry piece of bread, a slice of buttered bread, and a slice of bread with butter and salt. In addition, she placed beside this feast the bowl that apparently had been reserved for Gregor once and for all. It was now filled with water, and out of delicacy, since she knew Gregor would not eat it in front of her, she quickly withdrew, and even turned the key in the lock so that Gregor would understand he could make himself at home. Gregor's little legs whirred as he now went to take his meal. His wounds, incidentally, seemed to have healed entirely in the meantime, for he no longer felt the least impairment. This was astonishing, for more than a month ago he had cut his finger just a tiny bit with a knife, and this wound had still been painful enough just the day before yesterday. Might I be less fastidious than before? He thought, already sucking greedily at the cheese, to which he found himself immediately inexorably drawn, more than to any of the other items. Quickly, his eyes shedding tears of gratification, he devoured in swift succession the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh food, by contrast, did not taste good to him. In fact, he could not even stand the smell of it, and so, dragging the things he wished to eat a little to one side. He had long since finished everything, and was just lying indolently where he was, when his sister slowly turned the key in the lock as a signal for him to withdraw. At once he gave a start, though he had been on the point of nodding off, and he hurried back under the settee. But it cost him a great deal of willpower to remain there, even for a short period of time his sister spent in the room, for the hearty meal he had enjoyed had caused his abdomen to swell, and he could scarcely breathe in his confinement. In between little attacks of suffocation, he peered out with slightly bulging eyes as his sister, oblivious, used a broom to sweep up not only the remains of his meal, but also the food he hadn't even touched, as if these items, too, were no longer fit for consumption. Then she hastily dumped everything in a bucket that she covered with a wooden lid, before carrying it all out of the room again. She had scarcely turned her back when Gregor hauled himself out from under the settee, stretching and puffing up his body. This was how Gregor now received his food each day, once in the morning, when his parents and the maid were still asleep, and the second time after everyone had eaten lunch, for his parents would always nap a little afterward, and his sister would send the maid out on some other errand. Surely they didn't want Gregor to starve either, but perhaps it would have been too much for them to experience his meals through more than hearsay, or perhaps his sister wanted to spare them even this modest sorrow, for Lord knows they were suffering enough. Gregor never learned on what pretext the doctor and locksmith had been sent away that first morning, For since he himself could not understand, it occurred to no one, not even his sister, that he could understand the others. So when his sister came to his room, he had to be content merely with hearing the sighs she heaved now and then, and her words of supplication addressed to the saints. Only later, when she had started to grow accustomed to all of this, though of course it was impossible to become fully accustomed to circumstances like these, would Gregor sometimes catch a remark that was meant in a friendly way, or could be interpreted as such. "He tucked right in today," she would say when Gregor had found the food she left him particularly tasty, while in the opposite case, which gradually began to occur more and more often, she was in the habit of saying, almost mournfully, "This time he didn't touch a thing." But while no news reached Gregor directly, he sometimes was able to overhear this and that from the rooms to either side of his. And whenever he heard voices, he would immediately run over to the door in question and press his entire body against it. Especially in the early days, there was rarely a conversation that did not somehow, if only indirectly, refer to him. For 2 days, every mealtime was spent deliberating how the family should now comport itself. But even between meals, this same discussion continued, for at least 2 members of the household were present at all times, since apparently no one wanted to remain at home alone, and of course leaving the apartment unattended was out of question. What's more, the maid had fallen on her knees before Gregor's mother that very first day. It was not entirely clear what and how much she knew of what had occurred, begging to be released from the family service, and when she took her leave a quarter of an hour later, she tearfully thanked them for dismissing her, as though this were the greatest benefaction she had experienced at their hands, and without anyone asking this of her, she swore a solemn oath never to reveal anything at all to anyone. Now Gregor's sister was forced to do the cooking in concert with his mother. To be sure, not much effort was involved, as no one did much eating. Again and again, Gregor would hear one of them pressing the others to eat, always in vain, and never with any other response than, "Thank you, I've had all I want," or similar words. Perhaps they didn't drink anything either. Often Gregor's sister would ask her father if he wouldn't like a beer, affectionately offering to fetch it herself, and when he did not respond, she would say, wishing to relieve him of all scruples, that she would send the porter's wife for it as well. But then the father would utter a great "no," and no one spoke of it any longer. Already in the course of the first day, Gregor's father explained the family's finances and prospects not only to Gregor's mother, but to his sister as well. Now and then he would get up from the table, and from his small Wortham safe, which he had salvaged when his business collapsed 5 years before, extract some receipt or memorandum book. One could hear him opening the complicated lock and then bolting it shut again after removing the desired item. These explanations on his father's part included the first bits of heartening news Gregor had heard since his captivity began. He had been under the impression that his father had retained nothing at all of his former firm's holdings, or at least his father had never said anything to the contrary, and admittedly, Gregor himself had never asked him anything about this. At the time, his only concern had been to do everything in his power to let the family forget, as quickly as possible, the mercantile catastrophe that had plunged all of them into a state of utter hopelessness. And so he had set to work with particular zeal, and risen almost overnight from petty clerk to salesman, in which capacity, of course, he had a quite different earning potential, and his professional accomplishments, in the form of commissions, were immediately transformed into cash that could be plunked down on the table at home, before the eyes of his astonished, delighted family. Those had been lovely times, and never since had they been repeated, at least not with such glory, although Gregor later earned so much money that he was in a position to cover the expenses for the entire family, which he then did. All had grown accustomed to this arrangement, not just the family, but Gregor as well. They gratefully accepted the money, and he was happy to provide it. But the exchange no longer felt particularly warm. Only Gregor's sister had remained close to him all this time, and it was his secret plan to send her off to study at the conservatory next year. Unlike Gregor, she dearly loved music, and could play the violin quite movingly. Despite the considerable costs this would no doubt entail, money that could surely be brought in by other means. Often during the brief periods of time Gregor spent in town, the conservatory would come up in conversations with his sister, but only ever as a lovely dream, whose realization was unthinkable, and their parents did not like to hear it mentioned, even in this innocuous way. But Gregor was thinking the matter over with great determination and intended to make a formal announcement on Christmas Eve. Thoughts like these, utterly futile in his current state, passed through his head as he stood pressed against the door, eavesdropping. Sometimes, general exhaustion made it impossible for him to go on listening, but he would carelessly let his head bump against the door. But then he would immediately hold his head still again, for even the faint sound this produced had been heard in the next room, causing everyone to fall silent. "I wonder what he's getting up to now," his father would say after a while, apparently facing the door, and only then would the interrupted conversation resume. Gregor now learned quite well. His father tended to repeat himself in his explanations, in part because it had been so long since he had last concerned himself with such matters, in part because Gregor's mother did not always understand everything the first time, that despite all their misfortunes, a small nest egg, really only a tiny one, still remained to them from before, and had even grown a little thanks to the untouched interest that had accumulated meanwhile. In addition, the money Gregor had brought home each month, he only ever kept a few gulden for himself, had not yet been entirely used up, and had grown into a small capital. Behind his door, Gregor nodded eagerly, delighted at this unexpected prudence and thrift. To be sure, he might have used this surplus to pay off more of his father's debts with his boss, and the day on which he would have been able to divest himself of this post would no longer have been nearly so far off. But as things stood, his father's arrangements were no doubt for the best. Now, this money was by no means sufficient to allow the family to live off of the interest or anything of that sort. It might possibly have been enough to sustain the family for a year, 2 at most, but that's all there was. So in fact it was the kind of sum one really shouldn't touch, one to be set aside in case of emergency. The money to live on would have to be earned. Gregor's father was admittedly in good health, but he was old and hadn't worked in full 5 years, and in any case he was supposed to avoid overtaxing himself. In those 5 years, the first holiday in his strenuous and yet unsuccessful life, he had put on a lot of weight, and now lumbered as he walked. And was Gregor's old mother now supposed to hold down a job, despite her asthma and the fact that it was already an exertion for her to cross from one end of the apartment to the other, for which reason she spent every second day gasping for breath on the sofa beside the open window? And was his sister to go out working? This child of 17, whose lifestyle no one would begrudge her, dressing nicely, sleeping late, helping out around the house, taking part in a few modest entertainments, and above all playing the violin. Whenever the family came to speak of the necessity of someone earning money, Gregor would let go of the door and throw himself down upon the cool leather sofa beside it, burning with shame and sorrow. Often he would lie there the entire long night, not sleeping for a moment, just scrabbling for hours against the leather, or, not shunning the great effort it cost him to push an armchair over to the window, he would climb up the sill and, propped in the armchair, lean against the window, apparently lost in some sort of reverie of how liberating he had always found it to gaze outside. For in truth, he saw even the objects that were quite near at hand less and less clearly as the days progressed. The hospital across the way, whose all too constant sight he had earlier reviled, was now no longer even visible to him, and if he had not known perfectly well that he was a resident of Charlottenstrasse, a quiet but perfectly urban street, he might have imagined he was gazing out of his window onto a desert in which the gray sky and the gray earth were indistinguishably conjoined. His attentive sister only had to see the armchair standing beside the window twice before she started pushing it back to its place, there each time she tidied his room. Indeed, she even began leaving the windows in her sash open. If only Gregor had been able to speak to his sister and thank her for all she was compelled to do for him, he would have found her ministrations easier to bear. As it was, he suffered beneath them. His sister, to be sure, did all she could to obscure the awkwardness of the situation, and the more time passed, the better she succeeded, of course. But Gregor came to see it all more and more clearly. Even the way she made her entrance jangled his nerves. The moment she came in, without even pausing to shut the door, although she always took such pains to shield the others from the sight of Gregor's room, she would race straight away to the window and fling it open with hasty hands as though she were on the point of suffocating. then remain there, however cold it might be, gulping in the air. All this racing and racket was inflicted on Gregor twice a day. He would be trembling beneath the settee, painfully aware that she would no doubt have willingly spared him this disruption if it were possible for her to endure being in the same room as Gregor with the window closed. Once, it must have been a month since Gregor's metamorphosis, so there was no particular call for his sister to be startled by his appearance. She came into his room a little earlier than usual and discovered him, motionless, propped upright, as if for horrific effect, gazing out the window. Gregor would not have found it surprising if she had chosen not to enter, since his position prevented her from opening the window right away. But she didn't just not enter. She started in alarm and shut the door. A stranger might have thought Gregor had been lying in wait, meaning to bite her. Gregor naturally went and hid himself away beneath the settee, but he had to wait there until noon before his sister returned, and she seemed far more agitated than usual. From this, he understood that his appearance was still unbearable to her, and would remain so, and that she no doubt had to struggle to force herself not to run away at the sight of even the small part of his body that protruded from beneath the settee. In order to spare her even this sight, one day he carried the bedsheet over to the settee on his back. This labor cost him 4 hours, and arranged it in such a way that he was now completely covered, so that his sister would not be able to see him, even if she bent down. If she considered the sheet unnecessary, she could have removed it, since it was clear enough that it could not possibly be considered a pleasure for Gregor to shut himself off so completely. But she left the sheet where it was, and Gregor even thought he glimpsed a grateful look, when at one point he carefully lifted the sheet just a little with his head to see how his sister liked the new arrangement. During the first fortnight, Gregor's parents could not bring themselves to enter the room, and often he heard them expressing their heartfelt appreciation of his sister's labors, whereas they earlier had been often annoyed with her, since she had seemed to them a rather useless girl. But now both of them, father and mother alike, would often be waiting just outside Gregor's door while his sister tidied up his room, and as soon as she emerged, she had to give a full report on what things looked like in the room, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether perhaps any modest improvement could be seen. His mother, incidentally, had wanted to visit him relatively soon, but his father and sister held her back, appealing at first to her sense of reason, as Gregor listened attentively, wholeheartedly approving. Later, though, she had to be held back by force, and when she then cried out, "Let me go to Gregor! He is my unhappy son! Can't you understand that I must go to him?" Then Gregor thought it would perhaps be good for his mother to visit him. Not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. After all, she had a far better grasp of things than his sister, who, despite her courage, was still a child, and when it came right down to it, had perhaps only taken on this difficult task out of childish frivolity. Gregor's wish to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the day, Gregor avoided showing himself at the window, if only out of consideration for his parents, but there wasn't much crawling he could do in the few square meters of space the floor provided. Lying still was already difficult for him to endure during the night. Eating had soon ceased to give him even the slightest pleasure, and so to divert himself, he took up the habit of crawling back and forth across the walls and ceiling. He particularly liked hanging from the ceiling high above the room. It was completely different from lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely there. A gentle swaying motion rocked the body, and an almost happy absent-mindedness Gregor experienced. It might happen, to his own astonishment, that he would let go and crash to the floor. But now, of course, he had his body far better under control than before, and even as great a fall as this did him no harm. His sister immediately noticed this new entertainment Gregor had devised for himself. His peregrinations left behind sticky trails here and there, and she got it in her head to make it possible for Gregor to range as widely as possible by removing the furniture that impeded his movement. Above all, the wardrobe and desk. But she wasn't able to do so on her own. She didn't dare ask her father for help. The maid most certainly would not have helped her, for this girl of 16 or so, though she had courageously remained in the household after the departure of the former cook, had at the same time requested the privilege of keeping the kitchen locked at all times, and only opening the door upon particular request. And so the sister had no choice but to summon her mother one day when her father was out. The mother arrived with exclamations of feverish joy, but fell silent at the door to Gregor's room. At first, of course, Gregor's sister checked to confirm that all the room was as it should be. Only then did she allow her mother to enter. With utmost haste, Gregor had tugged the sheet down, lower and in looser folds, so that it really did look as if a bedsheet had just happened to have been tossed over the settee. He also refrained from peering out from beneath the sheet this time. For a moment, he would resign himself to not seeing his mother, and just be glad she had come. "It's all right. Come in. You won't see him," Gregor's sister said, apparently leading her mother by the hand. Gregor now heard the sounds of these two weak women, grappling with this, in fact, quite heavy old wardrobe, with his sister laying claim to the bulk of the work, not listening to the admonitions of her mother, who was afraid she would overtax herself. It took a very long time. After perhaps a quarter of an hour's labor, Gregor's mother said that they should leave the wardrobe where it was, after all. In the first place, it was too heavy. They would not finish before Gregor's father came home, and by leaving the wardrobe in the middle of the room, they would prevent Gregor from moving around at all. And secondly, it wasn't even clear they were doing him a favor by taking away the furniture. To her, it seemed the opposite was true. The sight of the empty wall positively oppressed her heart. And why should Gregor not experience the same sentiment, since, after all, he was long accustomed to having this furniture around him? Wouldn't he feel abandoned in an emptied-out room? And is it not as if, his mother concluded in a low voice, in fact she had been whispering all along, and as though she wished to avoid letting Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, hear so much as the sound of her voice, for she was convinced he could not understand her words. And is it not as if by removing all the furniture we would be showing that we're giving up all hope of a cure and are ruthlessly abandoning him to his own devices? I think it would be best if we try to keep the room in precisely the same state it was in before, so that when Gregor returns to us, he'll find everything unchanged, which will make it that much easier for him to forget all this has happened in the meantime." Hearing his mother's words, Gregor realized that the absence of all human direct address, combined with the monotony of life in his family's midst, must have muddled his understanding over the course of these 2 months, for he could not otherwise explain to himself how he could seriously have wished to have his room emptied out. Did he really want to have this warm room, comfortably furnished, with family heirlooms, transformed into a cave or den, in which to be sure he would be able to crawl about unhindered in every direction, but at the price of simultaneously swiftly and completely forgetting his human past? He was already on the verge of forgetting, and only his mother's voice, which he had gone so long now without hearing, had shaken him awake. Nothing should be removed. Everything must remain. He was unwilling to forego the good influence his furniture had placed on his condition, and if the furniture got in the way of his practicing this mindless crawling about, this was by no means to his detriment. In fact, it was a great advantage. Unfortunately, his sister was of a different opinion. She had developed the habit, not entirely without cause to be sure, of presenting herself as the holder of particular expertise when discussing Gregor with her parents. And so now, too, her mother's counsel was reason enough for her to insist on the removal not only of the wardrobe and desk, as she had originally been intending, but of every last bit of the room's furnishings, with the exception of the indispensable settee. Naturally, it was not simply childish defiance and the hard-won self-assurance she had so unexpectedly acquired in recent weeks that dictated this demand. She had, in fact, observed that Gregor needed a great deal of space to crawl around in, while as far as anyone could see, he made no use whatever of the furniture. But perhaps the fanciful imagination of a girl of her age played a role as well, a sensibility always seeking its own gratification, and one which Greta now allowed to persuade her to render Gregor's situation even more horrific than before, so as to be able to do even more for him than she had thereto. For a room in which Gregor held sole dominion over empty walls was a place where no one other than Greta would ever dare to set foot. And so she held fast to her resolve despite the protests of her mother, who appeared troubled to the point of indecision, even by the room in its present state. She soon fell silent and helped Gregor's sister remove the wardrobe as best she could. Well, the wardrobe was something Gregor could do without if need be, but the desk would certainly have to stay. And no sooner had the women left the room with the cabinet, groaning as they pressed against the weight. Then Gregor poked out his head from beneath the settee to see how he might, cautiously, and as considerately as possible, intervene. But unfortunately his mother was the first to return while Greta was still in the next room, clasping the wardrobe in her arms and tipping it back and forth on her own, without of course moving it from the spot. But Gregor's mother was unaccustomed to his appearance. It might have made her ill to catch a glimpse of him, and so Gregor in alarm withdrew as fast as he could to the far end of the settee, but it was too late to prevent the front edge of the bedsheet from stirring a little. This was enough to attract his mother's notice. Startled, she froze for a moment, then went back to where Greta was. Although Gregor kept telling himself that nothing extraordinary was happening, just a few sticks of furniture being shifted about, he was soon forced to admit that all this coming and going on the part of the women, their little exclamations, the furniture scraping against the floor, had the combined effect of a tumultuous hubbub, intensifying all around him. And no matter how tightly he drew his head and legs in and pressed his body against the floor, he soon was forced to consider that he would not be able to endure this much longer. They were clearing out his room, taking from him all that was dear to him. They had already borne away the cabinet in which lay his fret-saw and other tools, and now they were prying loose the desk that had dug itself firmly into the floorboards, this desk at which he had written his homework assignments as a student at the commercial academy, and as a secondary and even primary school pupil. Truly there was no time left to explore the good intentions of these two women, whose existence, by the way, he had almost forgotten, for their exhaustion was now making them labor in silence, and one heard only their heavy footsteps. And so he burst out of hiding. The women in the next room were just leaning on the desk to catch their breath, changing direction 4 times as he raced about, for he really didn't know what to save first. But then his eyes lit on the picture of a lady, clad in all furs, conspicuous now on the otherwise empty wall, and quickly he made his way up to it and pressed himself against the glass, which adhered to him, pleasantly cool against his hot belly. At least this picture, which Gregor's body now covered up completely, was absolutely certain not to be taken away from him. He swiveled his head toward the living room door to observe the women as they returned. They hadn't permitted themselves much rest at all, and were already on their way back. Greta had slung one arm about her mother, and was nearly carrying her. "So what should we take next?" Greta said, looking around. Then her eyes met those of Gregor, where he clung to the wall. It was no doubt only because of her mother's presence that she kept her composure, bowing her face toward her mother to prevent her from glancing about. She said hastily and tremblingly, to be sure, "Let's go back to the living room for a moment, shall we?" Greta's intentions were perfectly clear to Gregor. She meant to bring their mother to safety, and then chase him from the wall. Well, let her try. He sat there on his picture and would not give it up. He'd sooner leap right in her face. But Greta's words succeeded in unsettling her mother even more. Taking one step to the side, she saw the huge brown blotch on the flowered wallpaper, and before she was able to realize what she saw there was Gregor, she cried out in a hoarse, shrieking voice, "Oh, God! Oh, God!" and fell back upon the settee, her arms spread wide as though she were giving up everything, and lay there without moving. "Gregor!" his sister shouted, raising her fist with a threatening glower. It was the first time she had addressed him directly since his metamorphosis. She ran into the next room to fetch some sort of essence that could be used to awaken her mother from her faint. Gregor wanted to help as well. There would be time enough to save the picture later, but he stuck fast to the glass and had to tear himself away by force. He, too, then ran into the next room as if he might offer his sister advice of some sort, like in the old days, but then could only stand idly behind her as she rummaged among various little bottles and scared her out of her wits when she turned around. One bottle flew to the floor, shattered, a shard of glass scratched Gregor's face, and some sort of corrosive medicine engulfed him without further delay. Greta took up as many bottles as she could hold and ran with them to her mother, slamming the door behind her with her foot. Gregor was now cut off from his mother, who was possibly on the brink of death, for which he himself was to blame. He could not open the door if he didn't want to drive away his sister, who had to stay there with his mother. There was nothing for him to do but wait, and tormented by his worries and self-reproach, he began to crawl about, crawling over everything. Walls, furniture, the ceiling, and finally, in his despair, as the entire room began to spin around him, he fell smack in the middle of the big table. A short while passed. Gregor lay there, spent, and around him all was still, possibly a good sign. Then the bell rang. The maid was naturally locked up in her kitchen, and so Greta had to open the door. Their father was back. "What happened?" were his first words. The look on Greta's face had no doubt revealed all. Greta's voice, as she responded, was muffled. Apparently, she was pressing her face against his chest. "Mother fainted, but she's better already. Gregor has broken out." "That's just what I expected," the father said. "I kept telling you, but you women refused to listen." To Gregor, it was clear his father had misinterpreted Greta's all-too-brief pronouncement to assume him guilty of some act of violence. So it behooved Gregor to try to pacify his father, as he was lacking both the time and the means to enlighten him. With this in mind, he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it so that the moment his father came into the living room from the vestibule, he would see that Gregor had every intention of returning at once to his room, that it was unnecessary to drive him back inside, and that one had merely to open the door, and he would disappear at once. But his father was in no mood to take a note of subtleties. "Ah!" he exclaimed upon entering, in a tone of voice suggesting he was at once furious and glad. Gregor pulled his head back from the door and turned it toward his father. He had truly not expected to see his father looking as he looked now, standing before him recently from paying as much attention as before to the goings-on in the rest of the apartment, and really he ought to have been prepared to find his changed set of circumstances. Even so, was this still his father? The same man who used to lie wearily entombed in his bed when Gregor set off on a business trip, who would greet him on the evening of his return sitting in an armchair in his nightshirt, who, incapable of rising, would merely raise his arms to signify delight, and on the rare walks they still shared, a few Sundays each year and on major holidays, would trudge between Gregor and his mother, who themselves were already walking rather slowly, moving even a bit slower than they bundled up in the old overcoat, always with his gingerly advancing cane, and almost invariably coming to a halt, and collecting his companions around him whenever he had something to say. Now he was standing properly erect, dressed in a smart blue uniform with gold buttons of the sort worn by porters in banking establishments. Above the jacket's tall, stiff collar, his powerful double chin unfurled. Beneath bushy eyebrows, his black eyes peered out acutely and attentively. His once disheveled white hair had been painstakingly combed and parted until it gleamed. He tossed his cap, to which a gold monogram was affixed, probably that of a bank, across the entire room in a wide arc to land on the settee, then advanced grim-faced upon Gregor with the tips of his long uniform jacket flung back and his hands in his trouser pockets. He himself probably had no idea what he intended to do. At any rate, he raised up each foot unusually high, and Gregor marveled at the gigantic dimensions of his boot soles. But he did not lose any time over them, having learned on the first day of his new life that his father considered only the utmost severity appropriate for him. And so he fled from his father, hesitating whenever his father stopped short, and then rushing forward again as soon as he stirred. They circled the room several times in this manner without anything decisive occurring, and indeed, given the slow speed at which the interaction was taking place, without its even having the appearance of a chase. For this reason, Gregor remained at floor level for the time being, especially as he feared his father might consider it particular wickedness on his part if he were to take refuge on the walls or the ceiling. To be sure, he was forced to realize he would not be able to keep up even this pace for long, since each time his father took a step, he himself had to execute any number of motions. A shortness of breath began to set in. Even in his earlier life, his lungs had been none too reliable. As he now lurched along, reserving all his strength for this continued flight, his eyes barely open, and not thinking in his stupefaction that there might be other ways of saving himself than running across the floor. Indeed, he had almost forgotten. He also had the walls at his disposal, though here, to be sure, they were obstructed by delicately carved furniture full of jagged, pointy edges. All at once something flew to the rug beside him, casually flung, and rolled across his path. It was an apple, and already a second one came flying after it. In horror, Gregor stopped in his tracks. There was no point continuing to run now that his father had decided to bombard him. He had filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the sideboard, and now was tossing apple after apple in Gregor's direction, for the moment not even bothering to take particular aim. The petite red apples rolled on the floor as if electrified, knocking into each other. One lightly lobbed apple grazed Gregor's back and slid off again harmlessly, but it was immediately followed by another that embedded itself in his back. Gregor tried to drag himself forward as if this sudden, shocking pain might vanish with a change of place, but he felt nailed to the spot and collapsed there, his legs splaying out, all his senses in a state of utter bewilderment. He caught only a last glimpse of the door to his room flying open, his shrieking sister and his mother running out of the room before her, wearing only a chemise. For his sister had undressed the unconscious woman to let her breathe more freely. Then he saw his mother rush to his father's side, her unfastened skirts slipping one by one from her waist as she ran, saw her stumble across these skirts as she threw herself at his father, and, embracing him in perfect union with him, but now Gregor's vision began to fail him. She clasped her hands at the back of his father's head and pleaded with him to spare Gregor's life.